Hello and welcome. My name is Phil Gervasi with Kentik, and I'm joined today by Doug Madory, the Director of Internet Analysis at Kentik, and a subject matter expert on how Kentik is used to examine and visualize traffic patterns as well as routing on the public internet. Now, today we'll be discussing how we can visualize the BGP propagation of a DDoS mitigation and why that capability is very important. So, Doug, thank you for joining me today, and it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Doug, before we really dig into this functionality, can you describe how DDoS mitigation services work to defend against a DDoS attack?
Right. So in this case, there's DDoS attacks can target websites and go after something that might be able to be protected by a CDN, but when it's attacking the specific IP addresses, so it's some piece of infrastructure or maybe a corporate network that you can't put into the cloud or a CDN, then this is something that you have to defend the IP addresses themselves. And to do that, then the way this is done these days is that there is a DDoS mitigation service provider or a vendor that will announce the address space that needs protection. And by doing so, it'll attract all the traffic that was the attack traffic that was directed at the target IPs. Internally, it's got its own system to filter or scrub, is often the terminology used to scrub out the bad traffic. And then there's often a GRE tunnel back, not visible to the internet, that connects back to the customer network to get the clean traffic on to the customer.
Okay, so this all depends on the propagation of BGP routes on the public internet, correct?
It is completely dependent on proper operation of BGP.
Okay, so then how do customers of DDoS mitigation services currently gain insight into how well a mitigation activity is working? I mean, it's actually working from a BGP perspective. So what would they learn from having that kind of a capability?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's not well understood is the process of propagation, or it's not an easy question to answer, and I think this hasn't been something that's been addressed well in the last in the years that this kind of capability has existed. So as a BGP analyst for the last 13 years, I see a lot of these activations. A DDoS mitigation activation in BGP is essentially a public event that is visible in public data. But the time it takes for the mitigation vendor to take over the address space is sometimes it can be a quick process, quick being 1 to 2 minutes to get global propagation. And then there's on occasion things go wrong, and it takes a lot longer. And that's something that I don't believe neither the customer nor even the vendor oftentimes has got great insight into when that happens or why it happens.
Right. So there's certainly a lot of complexity to the process, right? So can you describe then what can actually go wrong with a DDoS mitigation activation?
Yeah, so in these cases, we have the mitigation vendor trying to take over the address space by their AS is announcing the address space. Typically, this is done these days in the AS path. For those familiar with BGP, it'll show up as an upstream. More often than not, it may show up as originating, so the mitigation vendor's AS will show up as the origin, in which case there's a potential that those routes could be filtered if this address space has an ROA or a ROA and RPKI, and there are upstream telecom providers that are filtering invalids. If they haven't added the mitigation vendor to the ROA, then it's going to get filtered probably substantially and won't be able to take over the address space. Otherwise, you have 3 different parties that essentially, at least, that have to work in concert. You have the customer network, the former upstream or upstreams, the providers that were announcing the customer's network to the internet, and now this new entrant of the mitigation provider. So the former upstreams have to stop announcing this address space, and the mitigation provider has to start, and that has to happen at the same time. And if there's overlap, then the two the two networks are basically in contention. You have the former upstream or upstreams announcing the address space, the mitigation provider, and they're fighting with each other to figure out who is the best path for the internet to take. In the meantime, that protection that the mitigation provider is providing is greatly limited when this scenario takes place.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool discussion, Doug. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts to identifying and then mitigating a DDoS attack. And to me at least, it's very interesting to think about how there's even an element of synchronization and how routes have to be announced by a mitigation service and how all of that works. But now I would like to see how this can be visualized with Kentik. So can you walk us through that and show us how that looks in the platform?
Would love to. So why don't we start with looking at how an activation is supposed to happen and how it's supposed to look in our visualization. So in this case, we're looking at this customer Hibernia services on a recent DDoS on-demand DDoS activation using Cloudflare's DDoS mitigation service. And so what we see in this plot along the top here is we're looking at all of our BGP sources and the paths that it takes to get to this Hibernia network, which is AS51677. So prior to the activation, basically 100% of the internet uses GTT AS3257 to reach this network. Then at some point, somebody makes a decision to activate the Cloudflare DDoS mitigation. And here we see this transition of what is the upstream transitioning and how does the internet in mass see that transition. So it's a pretty quick process. Within about 2 minutes, you've got the entire internet has switched over to now routing through Cloudflare to get to the Hibernia network. That is a good activation. Let's see. So here's here's the activation. It's a steep slope. It's not instantaneous because these routes do have to travel the entire planet to get to 100%. And then during this phase that's colored in purple here, we're basically essentially going entirely through Cloudflare, and eventually they turn it off, and there's a slope as well on the way out as you deactivate. The deactivation maybe is less critical. Usually the activation side, especially in an on-demand scenario, you are under attack or your network is under attack. You want that thing immediately. There's some lag time to collect the data. There's a lag time to activate, and then there's a lag time for these BGP routes to propagate. So time is of the essence, and you want this slope as steep as possible. So if that makes sense, then maybe we'll move on to an example when this doesn't work right, or it's less than optimal. So this one's not horrible. Trust me, there's far worse, but this is a case where, if you recall in the previous example, you had a straight slope right up. The internet took over within about 2 minutes. In this case, it's taking a while for this DDoS path to take over. And so for this is a registrar, a Russian registrar. So there's been, this year in 2022, a lot of stuff in Russia is under attack and retribution for the invasion of Ukraine. And so in this case, this registrar is using another AS with DDoS Guard, the Russian DDoS mitigation vendor, as an upstream. And you'd have to have some inside knowledge to know exactly what's taking place here to cause this delay as this route takes over. It could be that the other upstream is taking a while to stop announcing, but in this period there's contention, and so this is 1509 to 1523, so we're looking at over 13 minutes where there's two upstreams vying for contention, and during that period of time, if these guys are under attack, then the green area is where the attack traffic can get into the network, and it's not getting protected.
All right, so I understand that we can't necessarily tell why there's a delay in the propagation, but it does seem incredibly valuable to know that there's a delay in the first place, right? Let alone that the actual mitigation process started and ended, right?
Yeah, so in my career in the last, 7 or 8 years, we've had the outfits I've been at, we've had people come to us knowing we were BGP experts and say, like, we have this DDoS mitigation service we pay a lot of money for, and we have some doubts as to its timing, and we don't have any way to know when this really takes over. We know we push the button at a certain point, and I don't know that. I just know when it starts showing up in BGP. So we would go through this kind of manually and inform them of when these things took place, and that helps them identify. Is it their problem? Is it the vendor? In their case, in these cases I've had in the past, usually the vendor says, nope, there's nothing wrong. And that's not very satisfying because they feel like there is something wrong. So this was the key to figuring out at least the beginning of understanding why their activations weren't as timely as they had expected. And then, there's another, this one is another example where, let's see if we can see the bottom. This is Elevon, last month, activating Prolexic, Akamai's Prolexic. The previous upstreams were Sprint and Verizon. And again, you get into this situation where Prolexic's only achieving about 67% of the propagation, and this kind of just stays this way. So there's something persistent that's happening here that they're never able to achieve 100%. And I know that when I explain this to people, sometimes they think, well, maybe that's intentional. Maybe they know precisely where the DDoS traffic is coming from. And I can assure you that that is not the case, because you just can't know, both due to the nature of a DDoS attack comes out of random devices all over the internet. And then there's also the vagaries of internet routing. It's very hard to predict how traffic gets from point A to point B. For this to work, it needs to be 100% or nothing. Anytime you see this incomplete activation, there's a problem, and then the customer needs to figure out, if this guy was under attack in this scenario, I guess we could check our net flow to see, but if there was an attack, they would not be getting the full coverage of the DDoS mitigation provider.
Doug, I have another quick question for you. How long does it take for this information to get into our system and then be usable? I mean, it can't exactly be real time. So how long is it until the Kentik platform has it into the system for an engineer to use?
It's pretty quick. I mean, it's just a couple of minutes. But you're right. There is a lag time for BGP propagation to take place. There's a period of time, a non-zero amount of time for it to get into our system and into the product, but it's pretty quick. I think you could still use this during an attack. These things can last long enough that you would, if you're having problems and you need to figure out, is this possibly the cause of my ineffective mitigation, then you'd have time to pull this up and take a look and see if this is the issue. So those are a couple examples. I would say that for these on-demand, and we didn't mention it earlier, but there's two flavors here. There's kind of always on, where someone has just paid to nail up their stuff through a DDoS mitigation provider permanently, and it's there's a greater expense involved in that. It's just like as the name suggests, this is always on, and to save on costs, a lot of customers opt to do this on-demand thing. So just when the attack takes place, do they want to activate this and run all their traffic through this mitigation provider? And so for I'd say most on-demand activations look something like this, and then there's a minority that takes some other kind of shape. And if it's not a straight line going up like here, then there's if they're under attack, then their mitigation is not doing all it could.
Hey, Doug, I want to interrupt you one last time. Now, I do see that the moment the mitigation was turned off and traffic went back to normal is also displayed in the visualization here. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I guess you would want to know when you turned it off, so you're paying for this time of use of the system. So I guess you would want to make sure that fits, with what the usage claimed by the vendor. You can take a look at on your own. I think this is a neat capability that there hasn't been a way for a a customer of these kind of services, or even the vendor for that matter, to be able to have a third party be able to check up on these activations, that there's a lot of money going on here. These are actually really important. It's a really important part of internet service these days is trying to protect against DDoS activations, and you should be entitled to a clear picture of what's happening in the BGP space, and I don't think there's been a good solution on the market until now.
Doug, that was a great walkthrough of how we can really understand route propagation before and after mitigating a DDoS attack. It's really cool to see how we can visualize how traffic patterns can change and also understand how we should pay attention to that. So thanks for joining me. I really do appreciate your expertise in talking with you today. So to learn more about Kentik, and specifically Kentik's DDoS detection and mitigation capabilities, visit our website kentik.com/DDoS and check the resources there. And of course, you can always reach out to a Kentik representative as well to learn more and set up a demo. Thanks very much.